Tutto è santo, tutto è santo, tutto è santo. Non c'è niente di naturale nella natura, ragazzo mio. Tientilo bene in mente.
That which is now, and that which is to be hath already been. That which is now hath already been to be, and that which is now.
For the first time in the history of the world, a young girl climbed into a tree one day. She climbed down from the tree next day. God bless her.
Something is happening that is not happening.
Sex.
Something is happening which is not happening at all.
Is to be hath already been. That which is now hath already been. There is no remembrance of former things. A time, a time, a time, and 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 a time. But there is no new thing under the sun.
Take time, take time, take time, take time.
I think we reached a critical mass. Hey, everybody.
Hi.
Hello. I'm Evan.
Hi, Evan.
TF of 13 of you. The rest of you I may not have met. I get to lecture today. I'm really excited about it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Stephanie, for giving me the time to lecture. This is going to be a little bit of a different lecture. I'm going to synthesize a whole bunch of materials we've been reading. And then I'm going to go over, hopefully both the short stories that we assigned. We'll see how much time I have. So yeah, let's get started. Sci-fires, I have reason to believe that time travel is real. That there are time travelers among us. And I have proof. In 2012, a number of plaques began appearing in Soho, London, from a Mr. Jacob von Hofklund, the inventor of time travel. Von Hofklund even has his own Twitter feed, as any good time traveler should, which includes some rather astute observations that perhaps only a time traveler would think of. Von Honflume is not necessarily the first time traveler. Then again, it's difficult to establish who's the first time traveler. However, we know for a fact he is not the only time traveler. In 2012, a different time traveler, same year strangely enough, appeared outside the Large Hadron Collider in Switzerland. His name was Eloy Cole, and he said that he'd come there in order to stop the scientists at CERN from destroying the world. I read from the news article upon his arrest. Mr. Cole was seized by Swiss police after CERN security guards spotted him rooting around in bins. He explained that he was looking for fuel for his time machine power unit, a device that resembled a kitchen blender. Police said Mr. Cole, who was wearing a bow tie and rather too much tweed for his age, would not reveal his country of origin. He explained, "Countries do not exist where I am from. The discovery of the Higgs boson led to limitless power, the elimination of poverty, and Kit Kats for everyone." Quote unquote. It's a communist chocolate hellhole, and I'm here to stop it from ever happening. Like any good time traveler, Eloy Cole also has a Twitter feed. You can enjoy that on your own time. Before him, and I do mean relatively before him, there was John Titor, who sent faxes from the future to Art Bell, the famous radio personality and host of the paranormal radio show Coast to Coast AM, which is a radio show you should listen to at least one episode at some point in your life, especially if you can do it on an AM radio. Titor regularly talked to Art Bell, who broadcasted his musings over several episodes of the radio show. John Titor's message is actually rather an optimistic one. You're able to change your world for better or worse, just as I am. Although time travel may not be relegated to those special folk who have fancy time machines, such as H.G. Wells' Time Traveler, Dr. Who and his TARDIS, the scientists at the Large Hadron Collider, or whatever John Titor describes his time machine powered by two top-spin dual positive singularities that produce a standard offset Tipler sinusoid. We are all time travelers, moving through time at a rate of 1 second per second, though it's an experience time. Just a couple of weeks ago, was it 3 weeks ago now? The United States suddenly jumped backwards in time by a whole hour, and most of us slept through it. So, since we're all here together now in this room, time traveling at 1 second per second, at least until this lecture is over, I thought it would be good to talk about time travel, especially a little bit about the nature of time and how it relates to some of our readings. So let's get started. Just what is this time stuff anyway? In fact, it's extremely hard to define what time is. I don't know if anybody's tried to figure out what time is or has thought about this one before. And therefore, it's even more difficult to describe what we mean when we say that we're traveling through time. The classic quote is on the handout I gave you. It's from St. Augustine. It's the top quote. What is time? If no one asks me, I know what it is. If I wish to explain it to him who asks, I do not know. This is not a particularly helpful definition of time in any way whatsoever. But it does nicely sum up the problem of defining it. It is also the quote that comes up in almost every book about time that you will pick up, at least that I've picked up. So obviously you do the next thing if you're trying to figure out obvious things, you Google it, right? So if you Google time, here's what you get. You get a ton of pictures of clocks, which are not time in and of themselves, they're just pictures of things that measure it. So, like any good English graduate student, you might check the Oxford English Dictionary. Let's see what their helpful definition is. Time an extent of time. Considered as a period. Okay. A finite extent or stretch of continued existence as the interval separating two successive events or actions, or the period during which an action, condition, or state continues. Again, not super helpful. I have a theory that time might be the lengthiest definition in the OED. There's definitely an answer to this question, but this is definitely in the running for longest definition in the OED. Just scrolling through it gives one an experience of time, either spending it or wasting it. We have yet to make it even close to the bottom. Actually, I'll just keep scrolling for the state of it. Wikipedia has some better answers, surprisingly. There's two definitions that I kind of like. Wikipedia will tell you that time is what clocks measure, which is a circular definition, but not bad. And then two, this one's my favorite one. Time is what keeps everything from happening at once. Let that one sink in. Nod your head if you like that one. Okay. It's an interesting way to try to define something. If you can't figure out what something is, you kind of reverse the definition. You ask what the world would be like without it. Time is what keeps everything from happening at once. I'm still scrolling, by the way. Yeah. If you ask an astronomer, Sean Carroll, for example, you'll get an answer somewhere along the lines of time is a measure of the increase of entropy in the universe. Physicists in the room? Yeah, do you like that one? Kind of like it. That's a good one for Philip K. Dick. It fits nicely with a short story we're reading later in the anthology, Hamzo Lime's The Heat Death of the Universe. We'll keep that one in mind. If you ask a cosmologist, like Carl Sagan, he would say, to read is to voyage through time, which is a nice sentiment, but also not very helpful. He'd also say telescopes are time machines. Do we have astronomers in this class, actually? Just physicists, okay. Oh, okay, I can go on. If you ask a different physicist, I can't believe I'm still scrolling, like Tom O'Brien, who is in charge of the world's most accurate atomic clock at the NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology in Boulder, Colorado. Well, you'd surely think he would know what time is. Right? Uh-oh, where is he? Here's his answer.
Here's the first question. What is time?
My own personal opinion is that time is a human construct.
Tom O'Brien's opinion matters. He keeps time at the National Institute of Standards and Technology.
It's a way that we as humans have developed to try to understand and put some order in this very fascinating and complex universe around us.
If you ask a neuroscientist what time is, there's been some really interesting new books on this, like Team Buonamano. She'll tell you that your brain is a time machine. Also the title of this latest book. If you ask a psychologist like Mark Whitman, he will reframe the question. Rather than asking what time is, he'll study what the experience of time is. And then finally, there's perhaps the best answer. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, people don't understand time. It's not what you think it is. Complicated. Very complicated. People assume that time is a strict progression of cause to effect, but actually, from a non-linear, non-subjective viewpoint, it's more like a big ball of wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey stuff.
In short, time is a metaphor Quote another one of the quotes in your handout by Anthony Obeidi. Time gets spent, wasted, killed, kept, and lost. We have leisure time, quality time, good times, bad times, hard times, even hot times. When we say tempus fugit, we may not realize that the Romans, who coined that phrase, were equating time with ether. Time not only blows by us like a Roman wind, it also flies like a bird, walks like an old man carrying a scythe, flows like a river, and gets out of joint like our bones. In team sports, we can get out of it or back into it. In science fiction, we travel through it, through its many warps. Punctual businessmen are on it. Old people are beyond it. Prodigies before or ahead of it. And great comics and musicians are said to have a marvelous sense of it. Time, at its core, is nebulously and metaphorically ill-defined in just the sort of way that makes it a perfect subject for science fiction. And people love time travel. It satisfies wish fulfillment. It allows us to imagine alternative histories. It allows us to escape fear of the inevitable. It gives us control over death. And it also gives writers the chance to perhaps out-romance the most romantic of romances. By extending such romances across infinite time, incidentally, if anybody wants to talk with me about the time traveler's life, talk to me after class. I have feelings. There are definitely better romances, such as one I didn't assign for today, but I thought really hard about it. Robert Silverberg's Needle and a Time Stack, first published in Playboy. And then in our anthology, there's Kate Wilhelm's Forever Yours, Anna. So if you want to see a pretty good sci-fi romance, check that one out. Sci-fi is full of time travel, highbrow and lowbrow. By highbrow, I mean Chris Marker's La Jetée, an amazing film, which is about 20 minutes long. You should also watch that. From the cult classic Primer. Has anybody seen Primer? Good. Yes, you should try to watch it again, because if you've only seen it once, you definitely didn't get it. Arguably the most complex time travel film in history, or in film history. So the lowbrow, such as Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure.
That's not lowbrow.
You're right, it's actually. Time travel is almost a rite of passage. This anthology here, Time Traveler's Almanac, which I've read quite a bit of, is a testament to that. If you want to show your snuff as a sci-fi writer, at some point in your career, you're going to have to write some sort of time travel story. That's not cliche. Hard to do. Our readings today were William Gibson's The Gernsback Continuum and Langdon Jones's The Great Clock. They're two very different types of time travel stories. As far as time travel stories go, I would say that they're in some ways more mundane, more realistic, fitting with something Professor Burt mentioned, Jeff Ryman's The Mundane Manifesto. If you're looking for something more flashbangy, a little more exciting, a little more sparky, if you will, you also have Robert Heinlein's All You Zombies in the anthology. That's really a top 10 classics. Before I talk about these stories, though, I'd like to acknowledge that we've already seen a ton of time travel in this course. In fact, I'd argue that every book and short story we've read so far is concerned in some way or another with time travel. It's unavoidable. Any story must make some sort of assumption of what time is. The theorist Bakhtin calls this the chronotope. The way in which time is configured and represented in language and narrative. I was going to challenge you guys to bring up any story, and I was going to do a little prestidigitation and reframe it around time travel, but then I just did it anyway. So I won't cold call any cold call anybody. Let me oversimplify the Chronoctopus in a bunch of the stories we've read. Neuromancer is about a hacker who refuses digital humanity, or immortality. San Junipero is about two protagonists who accept digital immortality. Edward Bellami's Looking Backwards is too obvious to even point out. Herland is all about an all-woman utopia where time works differently because, and I quote, I think this is on your sheet as well, their time sense was not limited to the hopes and ambitions of the individual life. They habitually considered and carried out plans for improvement that might cover centuries. In Herland, temporal thinking is similar to cathedral building, generational thinking. Temporal short-sightedness in Gilman is a male thing. Tiptree's Houston, Houston is a retelling of Herland, set in a time and place so far off in the future that alas, it's impossible to escape men. The only men who make it through this utopia are men who have happened through time warp themselves. Frederick Pohl's Gateway is all about a guy who feels guilty for getting his friends trapped forever, for eternity, in a black hole. Ubik is about Ubik is hard to say. Ubik is about a negentropic universe where time flows backwards and then suddenly very far forwards for individuals. Not unlike another story in the Wesleyan anthology, Repent, Harlequin, said the TikTok man. Heinlein's Orphans of the Sky is a story about a future society on a generations-long space voyage who forget, by a series of unfortunate events, that they still live in a spaceship and mistake it for the whole universe. Ian Forrester's Machine Stops is a similar premise, a story about a society living in a complex subterranean machine that services their every need, a society that eventually forgets that they built the machine in the first place. And then, of course, there is the Connecticut Yankee. Professor Berg already glossed this, but I think this is one of the coolest things. One of the coolest things we read in this class. So let me repeat a little bit what Professor Berg said. In 1991, a professor of English at Georgia Tech named Bud Foote read a ton of Western literature and could find no instance before Mark Twain's Connecticut Yankee in which time travel, specifically time travel to the past, which a protagonist travels to the past and tries to change something, had ever been attempted. The strangeness of this is kind of difficult to imagine. Until 1889, the year the Connecticut Yankee was published, and presumably the 5 years before when Mark Twain was drafting the Connecticut Yankee, no one thought to write a narrative of time travel to the past. I'm repeating myself, but it's so strange. What do I mean? I mean the Trojans never imagined burning down that damn horse. I mean Dante never imagined, who imagines hell, purgatory, heaven, speaking to God, never occurred to him at any point to go back and save Beatrice from death. Juliet might have liked a do-over, that whole Romeo suicide pact kerfuffle. The Library of Alexandria might be saved from burning down. Then we might have examples of narratives of time travel into the past. Surely, time travel is a sort of wishful thinking that goes hand in hand with nostalgia, that Odyssean affliction, that time sickness. Odysseus, despite all his travails, never imagined, stopping any of the series of unfortunate events that led him to journey for 7 years. To quote Bud Foote, and I think I put this on your sheet as well, philosophers, ancient and medieval, pagan and Christian, all agree that even God cannot change the past. You ready for this? Even Jesus, though he was able to raise the dead, apparently could not spare Lazarus the agony of having died. Nor does the idea seem to have even occurred to him. While God could, without violating his own rules, create unicorns or centaurs, cause somebody to sleep for 100 years, or even temporally and locally reverse entropy by raising someone from the dead, changing the past would seem to shake the very fabric of the universe. And yet, it seems to us, those they being people before Mark Twain, must have thought of it. Like us, they must have had if-onlys. If only I could go back and change that one thing. But nobody seems to have thought that way, at least if your archive is Western literature. This is to propose a change in the quality of human consciousness. Travel to the past and change to that past. It seems to have been a sort of mega foolishness which nobody could think of. At least not until Mark Twain. This epiphany, for me at least, makes Connecticut Yankee all the more remarkable because it has, for the first time, imagined something that has never been imagined before. The novum here turns the question back on the audience. It makes the reader ask him or herself, just what else haven't we thought of? What sort of obvious things exist beyond the bounds of our collective 21st century imaginations? What would be obvious to a future audience that is invisible to us? Sci-fi is really good at asking questions like that. So let's shift to something we read just a couple weeks ago, Galatea 2.2. Galatea 2.2 isn't really explicitly about time travel, and yet it is very, very much about time travel. We can look at the more mundane details of the story. For example, Rick's time sickness, also known as FOMO, fear of missing out. What quads were for generations of student sadness to lie down on in the crisp blue of the first week of the year's end. Everything we saw, we staked out. As we staked out our spot, said, last November, ever. The first of an almost endless list of lasts. That's a really great line. Endless list of lasts. Though this FOMO, this fear of missing out, is very much connected to Rick's persistent nostalgia, again, nostalgia being another type of time sickness, it's not irrelevant. The entire plot is based on bouncing between and interweaving two distinct time periods, one in which Rick is in his mid-20s and progressing through his relationship with C, the other in which he is in his mid-30s and teaching Helen. The two time frames superimpose on one another via the time-traveling power of memory, such that events, symbols, themes, etc. resonate in the remembrance of things past. Neither narrative timeline would be complete without its counterpart. Thus, we could say the entire narrative structure of Galatea 2.2 depends on the time-traveling power of memory. Simultaneously, I think it is safe to say that time is what makes Galatea 2.2 a science fiction in the first place. Does anybody remember what it was that transformed into H, into Helen? There's a hint. It's on the screen. On page 179, we learn that as soon as Rick realizes H is complex enough to experience time, at that moment, if H is if H no more. If H transforms into Helen. And this is our quote. H clocked its thoughts now. I was sure of it. Time passed for it. Its hidden layers could watch their own rate of change. Any pause on my part now would be fatal. Delay meant something. An uncertainty that might forever undercut the strength of the connection I was to tie for it. You're a girl, I said without hesitation. I hope I was right. You're a little girl, Helen. It is no mistake, then, that the next time Rick sees Helen, just like 10 pages later, she is singing. When I returned to the lab 2 days later, I thought I had dialed the wrong number. Even before I reached the door, it hit me. Sound rolled out into the hall, shockwaves in bonsai packages. I heard music emanate from Lenz's suite once before, but this was the air of a new planet. I rounded the corner, ready already to be dead. Inside, Helen was singing. You did this to her powers, says Lenz. This is a fitting detail. music is the form of art which is most temporally dependent. You can't have music without time. And by singing, Helen is learning not just about music, not just about the subject matter of the song, but also about the embeddedness of consciousness in the fabric of temporality. By singing, Helen is playing, experimenting, learning what time is. Powers has been leading us to this epiphany. On page 148, he notes, knowledge is temporal, it's about time. And shortly after, on page 154, Rick observes, meaning was not a pitch, but an interval. It sprang from the depth of disjunction, the distance between one circuit's center and the edge of another. Generally, we can say that Galatea 2.2 only becomes a science fiction when the imp becomes conscious. And that the novum is a computer that is conscious. Sure. Specifically, however, we can say that the novum is a computer that understands what it means to be temporally bound to the world. In the same way that Dr. Frankenstein infuses the spark of life into a corpse, so too does Rick infuse the spark of life, of consciousness, into what otherwise would be mute, unalive hunks of metal. And also, like Dr. Frankenstein, Rick too is an imperfect creator to his monster, whom he is responsible for, though he does not fulfill his duty to her. Her existence is the experience of being dropped down halfway. Okay, I think I've done due diligence to the course. Let's switch over to the great clock. I brought a prop. Good. The clock ticked. A man wakes up inside a colossal clock. If the metronome annoys you, then that's fitting. Man wakes up inside a colossal clock. He's been sleeping naked on the floor. A nod, I think, to a different time travel story, the story of Rip Van Winkle. The clock is described as, more or less, a giant grandfather clock, and it has all the same basic anatomy. A pendulum, the great wheel, a fast wheel, other miscellaneous wheels, pins, wedges, springs, and the bob, described as a 10-foot lens of gray metal tapered at the edges to a knife blade. Tapered at the edges to knife blade thinness, recalling, I think, Edgar Allan Poe's Hit and the Pendulum. He does not recall how he got there, but he knows that for as long as he remembers, his entire life, he has been taking care of this clock, oiling its innards, adjusting its cogs, assuring its perpetual motion into perpetuity. Today will be his last day on the job. This story, like so many of the stories we've read in this course, is a subgenre of science fiction. I like to call this genre the last day genre. The basic premise of this apocalyptic subgenre is a thing that has been happening for a very long time suddenly stops happening. Can anybody think of any other examples? Machine stops. Any others? There will come soft brains. I think there are more, but that's good. We're good. Although the clock is essentially a giant grandfather clock, it is also inscrutable and unknowable. It contains a labyrinth of spinning wheels, grinding together like gears inside the head of some gigantic, omniscient engineer. Jones describes the gears as a mass of wheels, thousands upon thousands, interlocking in frightening complexity. Once he wondered whether he saw all the wheels, or whether in fact there were many more stretching away upward and downward. Comprehending the clock is a little bit like staring into two mirrors reflecting each other. Perceiving the clock from within is like the allegory of Plato's cave, which Jones references in a line, in the same line he first mentions the clockmaker, quote unquote, on the floor, was thrown a shadow of wheels which formed an abstract pattern. The clock fundamentally must be protected from entropy. Yet, time is entropy. within the clock, the one thing it has no relevance to, its own existence has no reference. It is time measured against a blank ruler. There's no stars, no suns, no cycles, no nothing, no basis for comparison. Outside of the clock, perhaps outside viewers have some sort of comparison for what it's measuring. But within, there's nothing. Every time it ticks, another second is tacked onto the present, allowing, I suppose, for more future. The great clock guarantees the continuance of the future for as long as the great clock can stay wound and avoid the entropic effects of the very thing it measures. Our protagonist is never named, and he has no companions. His boss is a smaller clock, a clock within the clock, which tells him when it is time to go about his maintenance work. He wonders once if there's a tiny man in the smaller clock within the clock who tends to the smaller clock within the clock, making sure its pendulum, its wheels, its escapement are oiled. There's a recursion of clocks here, a clock within a clock within a clock within a clock. And this is a philosophical question at its core. Is there a fundamental frame from which to compare all time? Where is the first wheel, the source of movement for all the other wheels? Is there a first clock, a prime clock, from which all other clocks are set? And if yes, who tends to that clock? And what clock does that clock tender use to schedule the maintenance necessary to keep that clock in proper time? It's turtles, all the way down, as the expression of infinite regression goes. Such questions about the clock minders within the clock are analogous to questions of the questions of consciousness broached in Galatea 2.2. What controls this tremendously complex thing you call your brain? Is there a little person in there that is the source of your thoughts? What is the source of that little person's thoughts? What is consciousness? Where do thoughts come from? Or at what point does consciousness arise from a line of not conscious stuff becoming sufficiently complex enough to form such a recursive loop? For the clock tender, time isn't measured in hours, but in the steady march of chores he must attend to. The clock tender eats his breakfast, though there is little reason for him to call it breakfast. Not only does time not proceed for him in any normal fashion that would suggest any need for the cultural construct known as breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but the food has no differentiation. It is it's described as completely tasteless, a white mash, poured out from a faucet, like so much hamster kibble. It's essentially the food they eat in the Matrix. Oh. Got it here.
Here you go, buddy. Breakfast of champions.
Our hero, then, is not Tantalus, reaching for the grapes or stooping for wine. Nor is he Prometheus, lashed to the side of a mountain. Our hero is Sisyphus, rolling a boulder up a mountain, only to watch it roll down. Yeah. This is the Sisyphus slinky. It's a dark metaphor for the human condition. The slinky doomed to the eternal repetition of a meaningless task. A depressing metaphor. I'm just going to let that play. We'll make it bigger. Though he works within the clock, he doesn't know how the clock works or who is without the clock. Nor does he have any conception of what the clock measures or who it measures it for. Nor has he taken any notice of this or questioned any of it. Thinking makes him bad at working. And yet he frequently approaches the precipice of tremendous questions, questions that threaten him with the abyss. Ego-forming, self-reflective, existential questions. The question, essentially, of why am I doing this? Time, without differentiation, is sameness. And since there's nothing but sameness and absolute regularity for our Sisyphean hero, he has never had a second thought about any of it until today. You could say he hasn't even experienced time until this story takes place. He has lost his identity in his work, unaware of life or death, unconcerned with the corner piled up with the moldering corpses of the clockminders who came before him in varying states of decomposition. On this day, however, our protagonist will have his fall from ignorance, which is a literal fall, and an experience, I think, similar to what happens to Hank Morgan in the Connecticut Yankee. How does Hank Morgan get sent back in time?
Sit on the
He gets hit with a crowbar, yeah. He gets hit so hard upside the head, it literally knocks him into the Dark Ages. Interesting device. Similarly, it takes a thump on the head to knock our protagonist back into time. Rather than being knocked into the past, he's knocked into the present. The clout to the head alone provides him a sense of cognitive estrangement from this thing he's been doing all along. After which the clock looks alien and frightening. Jones is playing with a bunch of tropes here. The clock tender's fall is a reference to the lapsus of Genesis, the fall of Adam and Eve from a state of grace after eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Before that, Adam and Eve wandered the garden in an atemporal state of unthinking bliss. Jones here provides us dystopian sci-fi equivalent. The clock tender no longer mindlessly performs the meaningless repetition of his allotted tasks. Again, time without repetition is sameness. And thus, from the perspective of the clock tender, nothing has ever happened until today. Which is why he sees, for the first time, everything around him with eyes unclouded by time. Which is another biblical reference to Corinthians. This is to see with eyes unclouded by time is a description of this moment of epiphany, of awakening, of defamiliarization from this nightmarish landscape which has been so familiar. Jones brings the reader into a confrontation with the terror of being trapped in something so huge and horrible, yet being utterly unable to perceive that you're caught up in it. With the return of his sense of time, so too return his other senses. He perceives, he smells, he smells the rotting bodies. He hears the maddening ticking of the clock, the humming of the clock, permeating him. And here Langdon Jones owes more of his debt to, I think, to a telltale heart, the ticking clock that drives you insane, which also you should read if you haven't read already. The sounds of the clock inflict bodily violence on him. His body, whenever it comes in contact with the clock, damages the clock, and vice versa. Only tools can touch the clock without disturbing it. And the sound of the clock, the sound of the passage of time, disturbs his body. What is described first as a mosaic of sounds transforms into particulars. He hears high sounds, which irritated the eardrums, and low ones, which stirred the bowels. His stomach churned by the deep vibration of the great wheel. Sounds almost made him vomit. Here again, we see those references to sound and music as a reminder of life and biology as something inherently time-bound. The parallel is, as his body begins to fail, so too does the clock begin to lose its accuracy. Time and humanity are bound to one another. As soon as the clock tender stops being mechanical, the horror of all the humanity of his position hits him. He realizes with dread that entropy has taken a toll on his body, that he has suddenly time traveled into the body of an old man, that all the while he's been reversing the effects of entropy on this clock, nothing has been reversing the effects of entropy on him. His body is thus a clock of its own, an index that records the passage of time by the length of his hair hanging down almost to his shoulders, his features covered by wrinkled and flaccid parchment. He cannot remember how long he has been there, which incidentally is not surprising. As Powers notes in Galatia 2.2, there's that great quote, which I put on your handout. Age lurches and fits and starts like a failing refrigerator compressor, like a gawky, grand, maladroit adolescent on ancient roller skates, navigating a stretch of worn sidewalk. in a subduction zone. It holes up a while, stock still, then slams out one afternoon to play catch-up ball. Age, fits, and lurches. Another great metaphor. Our clock tender has experienced here a radical lurch, I think from 25 to 80, and how old he is. The sense of time dilation is actually not sci-fi either. This is a real thing that happens to people. The book I mentioned, Your Brain is a Time Machine, by Dean Bonamano, notes several examples of people who are, what happens to people who are deprived of sunlight. In 1988, Veronique Le Guin spent 111 days in isolation in a cave in France. And at the time of her exit, she felt that only 42 days, she estimated that only 42 days had passed. There's some basic question about why anybody would do that in the first place. But it's an experiment that's been happening repeatedly since at least the 60s. In 1989, an interior decorator, Stefania Follini, spent 4 months in a cave 50 feet below the surface of the earth. Almost 4 months in, she believed only 2 months had elapsed. In 1993, an Italian sociologist spent a year in isolation in a cave, a year. And when he exited on December 5th, he believed it to be June 6th. That's kind of remarkable. So the idea that you can suddenly jump forward in time, or your experience of time could be completely convoluted, is a biological phenomenon that will happen to you if you ever find yourself waking up in a dystopian gigantic clock, which I hope you don't. Our clock tender is thus out of time. He can no longer fulfill his responsibility. I'm old, he cries, I'm old. Passing from manic glee to abject despair, he picks up a sledgehammer. And he realizes his own legacy. I'll fix you, he says. I won't even give you the pleasure of running quietly down, as you would have done with me. Oh no, my friend, you shall die violently. And with one strong, slow blow, he deforms a wheel and watches the damage as the damage propagates. Rippling through the labyrinth of cogs, gears, and wheels. Sparks rain, steel drums, splinters crack, and like so many statues of Ozymandias, so many towers of Babylon, the great clock comes crashing down. Here, Langdon Jones reminds us that time is what keeps everything from happening at once. At the end of his story, when the clock breaks, the whole world freezes. It freezes itself in a grotesque lack of activity. The clock, which generated time, adding second after second to the present, had also been generating the story. Notice that refrain, the clock ticks, over and over and over again throughout that story. Each time the clock ticks, it adds another second to the present. Each time the clock ticks, it adds another paragraph to the story. Thus, without the human element to maintain the clock, or a human reader to read the story, both the story and the clock collapse, and both time and meaning come to an end. I don't want it to tick again on this. I have a little bit of time to look at the Gernsback continuum, which is a very different type of time travel story. It's one in which the past erupts into the present and haunts the narrator. It's a ghost story. It's a story about time travel via telepathy. Telepathy is a great word. It refers to the realization of a potential. It's about pasts and parallel universes that existed potentially but collapsed. About futures that were imagined but never actually came to be. Gibson was originally going to call this story the Airstream Futuropolis, the tomorrow that never was, and then he changed it to the Gernsback continuum to emphasize the genre-wide critique he was making through the story. The narrator in it is haunted by visions of the 1939 World's Fair. Here we go. From my visions of the World's Fair. I will let it go now. which was themed Your World of Tomorrow. D'Alta Downs, his fictional historian, is more or less obsessed with the 1930s, 1940s American Art Deco future chic. Where is that? There's some of it. Those are the airships he's talking about. And then Gibson invents this amazing term, the semiotic phantom. Anybody have a working definition of what a semiotic phantom is? It's pretty strange. It's a common symptom of anybody who studies too much microhistory, such as D'Alta Downs. The historian begins to lose grip on the lines defining what was, what is, and what could have been. These three categories blend into each other. The historian begins to feel the opposite of nostalgia, a longing, not for the past, but for a past future. Let's see, Gibson describes the semiotic phantoms as fragments of the mass dream, bits of cultural imagery that have split off and taken a life of their own, like the Jules Verne airships. It's this idea that if we all believe something at once, that culturally manifests itself in an actual thing that can haunt us, even when that thing that we all imagine together doesn't come to pass. When a fictional past imagination of the future persists in manifesting itself in the present, as the 1939 Burns Body and World's Fair does in Gibson's short story, the semiotic ghost ruptures the boundary between past and present, demanding a reckoning between the possible future and the realized present. History, then, thus examined, abhors a line. Events may be ordered one after another, but the past perpetually erupts into the present. The future pulls back onto the past, and the parallel, unrealized potential universes perpetually pressure the present with the constricting squeeze of if only. A lot of other things are happening in this story, but we're running out of time. I thought I might take a minute to point out all his allusions. It's full of allusions. The narrator takes a diet pill, so a queer homage to Philip K. Dick. The offhand references to muties. There's a Heinlein term, of course, orphans of the sky. The colossal Tucson that never was. Seems as wild as the Emerald City. Where is it? There it is. The children of D'Alta Downs' 80s that wasn't. These are the heirs to the dream. They were white, blonde, and they had probably had blue eyes. They were American. Where's Tom Swift? We need Tom Swift. That's what we were talking about. Gibson merely imagines a world, the world that Heinlein and that Gernsback would have had for us. White, blue-eyed, streamlined, chrome, totalitarian, eugenic, American, male, technophilic, and utterly self-satisfied. This is Gibson's version of what Gernsback himself claimed was the goal of science fiction. So this is the Gernsback continuum that our narrator persistently rejects. And he says the cure, what was the cure? Media. Yeah, little brown media, like Nazi Love Motel, which you can go click on that link in your own time. I'll end by concluding what I started with, which is time travel is real. I hope I've convinced you. And if I haven't, you'll have to come to my next lecture. On the clock along now. Have a good one.
See you after Thanksgiving. I do have regular office hours this Tuesday. You can feel free to drop by. And as always, make an appointment if you want to see me about SF or anything else. And Tuesday, 1 to 4 p.m. is not rocket for you. Thank you, that was great.
Yeah. So you guys got the stuff that was on the syllabus for today.